Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Road to Recovery podcast. This podcast is a platform for education, discussion, and conversations on mental health. I'm your host, Amira Shah, and in this podcast, you'll get to know more about the therapeutic process, insight into life from the perspective of the psyche, and also join me in exploring current issues with other practitioners. I specialize in grief, but I'm always interested in learning about the human experience of the mind, heart, and spirit. So join me on this journey of in-depth learning about ourselves and the world we live in. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Science of the Soul. Today, I have with me a physiotherapist, Richmond. He is the founder of TRE Australia. He is the pioneer of neurogenic or spontaneous movement. He has a background in mental health and youth suicide prevention, an advanced diploma in Aboriginal Studies, and he created the world's first online TRE course. Hi, Richmond. Thank you for joining me today.
Thanks very much for having me, Amir.
Can you tell us a little bit more about what TRE is and do justice to this introduction that I've kind of butchered?
That's fine. So look, TRE originally stood for trauma releasing exercises. Sometimes now it gets called tension and trauma releasing exercises. And it's a simple process where we use very basic exercises to fatigue the muscles to the point where they start to shake and tremble. So, anyone who's ever done yoga or Pilates or the gym will have experienced that little shaking and trembling, which we all have just been told is a sign of fatigue or weakness or a lack of control. Whereas what we do with TRE is we get to that point where the muscles start to shake, and then we deliberately allow those shaking and trembling or tremors or movements to continue and build up and spread throughout the body. And the movements, the spontaneous movements that then arise, often shaking and trembling, but it could be other movements, get commonly referred to as neurogenic tremors, meaning that we're not consciously creating the movements of shaking or trembling, the body is generating it. And the easiest way to think about this is if any of the listeners, if you've ever done public speaking, or maybe you've seen someone public speaking and their hands start to shake. Now, we've all been told the shaking is a sign of nervousness, or if someone's had a car accident and they're shaking on the side of the road, we'll say that's shock. But that shaking and trembling is not part of the fight or flight or freeze response. It's not part of the anxiety. It's not part of panic. It's not part of shock. It's actually how the body recovers and dissipates shock, uses up adrenaline by generating these most, incredibly energy efficient movements to down regulate the system. So if my hands are shaking during public speaking, yes, it's a sign that I have been or I'm scared, but the shaking's not a part of being scared. It's how the body's trying to calm the nervous system down. So with TRE, we deliberately invoke this shaking and tremoring reflex because it helps us to calm our nervous system, to release sort of chronic tension and bracing, and help us get more connected to our body and bring our body back to life.
Thank you very much. That explanation is so insightful because, as you have said, a lot of us would assume that shaking and trembling is a fight or flight response. So thank you for clearing that up for all of us.
Yeah, you're welcome. And this is, we also need to keep it in the context that in the Western world and Western culture, we have all pathologized and stigmatized and misunderstood this shaking. Exactly that would say, oh, that's a part of panic. Like someone's shaking, they're going, I'm having a panic attack, rather than going, yes, there's been a panic response. Now that the shaking's happening, that means the panic's actually trying to reside or move away. But the reason it's important is that in a lot of other cultures all around the world and in lots of different contexts, the shaking and trembling is not misunderstood. That's really a Western phenomenon. And, individually and culturally and even medically, we might medicate against shaking and trembling. But, cultures like the Kalahari Bushmen, who are one of the oldest living cultures on the planet, part of their cultural identity is they call themselves the keepers of the shake. So they deliberately use this shaking and tremoring phenomenon. And then there's other, cultures, ancient samurai warriors used a process called seikijutsu, where they would meditate to the point where their body started to move spontaneously. And one of my favorite examples is traditional Swahili midwives, where women will give birth generally standing up, supported by a midwife on either side. They won't let that woman lie down after giving birth until her body's spontaneous shaking and trembling has come to a complete stop. And that could be up to 20 minutes or to half an hour, because they know through watching animals in the wild and watching women over tens of hundreds, if not thousands of years, that if they don't allow that natural discharge and completion of the shaking and trembling, that the woman will end up with problems afterwards. So I'm just, flagging that
Mm.
for most of us in our Western culture, we've absolutely just overlooked and dismissed this and pathologized it and stigmatized it in a way that many other cultures haven't. So we just think, oh, that's shock, or that's anxiety, or that's post-traumatic stress. And when we're talking about grief, we're like, oh, that's a sign that they're overwhelmed, rather than, wow, this is actually a natural process that arises spontaneously, but that we can also deliberately invoke in a safe and controlled way to release stress, tension, trauma, anxiety, and grief.
And as you're speaking, what comes up for me is that Western cultures and society, or at least the with Western medicine, with the introduction of Western medicine, there is a lot of emphasis and importance placed on being in control and controlling situations in our environment. And I understand why control is important, because living in uncertainty means, can be really dangerous for us. But it seems that we've overcorrected our need to control everything and anything that's happening, not only outside of us, externally, outwardly, but also within us.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think a lot of the origins comes out of the British sort of medical model and the British culture,
Mm.
who were famous for the concept of keeping a stiff upper lip.
Oh,
Now,
you just
when we
took the words
actually,
out of my mind.
that's right. So, and the reason we say a stiff upper lip is saying don't let your lips start to shake or tremble, or because you're going to cry, basically.
Mm.
And so it's deeply built into, certainly, that, when I say Western culture, certainly coming out of that medical model. And you also rightly point out, Amira, it's not about, life's all about letting go of control, although there are, again, in Japanese culture, the concept of wu wei, or the kind of the art of surrendering and allowing and flowing rather than controlling things. So there's both the capacity for us as humans to let go and surrender, but also it's a normal human capacity to be able to control things. But in our Western culture, again, the vast majority of us spend 99% of our time trying to control things. And from
Mm.
a young age in school, we're trained to use our intellect and our cognition, and even a lot of our movement and body-based practices like yoga and Pilates and gym, wonderful as they are, we know that, but we don't have often built into them the sense of, well, it's all about controlling the body, or controlling the breath, or controlling regulation, the nervous system, or controlling, respiration, anything at all. And again, these are all great positive skills. But what we tend to have overlooked and missed is this other end of the spectrum about letting go of control and being able to surrender to both our body and our body's spontaneous movements, but also the experience of life. Most of us are control freaks on one way or the other, and that's kind of what our ego has often done and been developed to. And it's often
Mm.
the idea of someone who's really in control of their life is often put up
Mm.
in Western society as that's kind of the that's kind of the ideal. And we've
Yeah, it's rewarded.
another bit.
The
Yeah,
more
that's
in control you are, the more you are rewarded. Oh,
yep.
this person's got his shit together. This person's really, on top of everything. He's in control with everything.
Yep. And again, that's a great positive skill to have, but it's at one end of the spectrum, being able to control movement volitionally and consciously, or, regulate your emotions when you need to do a job, or, you're a paramedic or a firefighter. All of those things are really valuable skills, but what we often lose is the ability to relax and let go and soften down. So most of us would find that, you know, our bodies get tighter over time. Our lives often get tighter, and none of us really lose the capacity for our nervous system to upregulate and go into a huge defensive response. You know, if a car backfires or a bomb goes off or you hear a child scream, just about everyone's nervous system is going to ramp up to 500 kilometers an hour. But what a lot of us lose is then when we go, oh, okay, that was just a car backfiring, or actually, you know, the child was giggling with laughter because it was a puppy or something. What we often lose, you know, coming home at the end of the day, or when we're talking about grief, is the capacity to switch off and allow the body to relax and go completely back into a soft, relaxed, open, safe, calm state. So it's about having both ends of the spectrum available.
It's the yin and the yang. And I remember that one of the philosophies of yin yoga, for example, was to surrender and to allow for the movements and the kings and the softening to just happen and not to force it, not to control it, essentially. And with a lot of these ancient philosophies as well, even in Islam, the hallmark of the religion or the philosophy is in surrender as well. And there's so much wisdom in that. Not so much, not only surrender cognitively or to, you know, existentially to whatever that will happen, but also to allow for our for us to allow our body to surrender so that we may learn from it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I love the model of the, you know, the yin and yang. It's so simple, but again, in Western culture, we often don't have that. We don't integrate the concept of letting go or being out of control or surrendering to the flow of life. And, you know, where and often the sort of belief systems and the structures we have about being in control, generally, you know, they serve us very well. But the point at which they don't is when we experience trauma or we experience, you know, loss and grief, which by definition is a loss of control. And in a lot of traditional cultures, often a lot more linked into the seasons and the cycles in nature, often the concept of trauma or grief or loss is built into their cultural practices. Whereas, again, in Western culture, we often don't have that concept. You know, we are all going to experience trauma in our life generally. You know, we're all going to die. All the people we're going to love are going to die. But we often spend so much time in Western culture trying to control things and prevent that from happening. Again, not to say that's wrong or bad, but we often overlook and we don't build into our culture this sense of, you know what, bad things are going to happen. And this is how we move through them and not just recover, but actually we grow and evolve. So, you know, it's built into the culture. And this is where, you know, we're talking about trauma, but also that concept of grief. A lot of our, you know, belief systems, they work very well while we're in control. And the point at which we get knocked around and fractured is then, of course, when we're not in control. And, you know, it's I think one of the great exaggerations of our Western culture is this idea of, you know, I can manifest everything, I can create everything. Not to say that there's not an element of that, but even if we're having the experience of, you know, manifesting something we're trying to look for or connect with, the entire rest of the universe has got to line up in order for that to occur. So I see it very much, you know, it's quite a young, you know, immature is not quite the right word, but a stage of development as people in our egos is that sense of, wow, I can control things, I can make things happen. And I think that reflects that Western culture in a way is quite a young, immature in a sense, you know, culture where we haven't yet integrated that sense of trauma. You know, it's not something just to be prevented, but something to be embraced, moved through, you know, that help develop our growth, including that concept of, okay, grief, letting go. How do we move through that? How do we prepare ourselves? How do we support ourselves, our children, our friends, our families, our society to actually move through grief and be moved through it rather than just trying to prevent it and crossing the fingers and hoping nothing bad will ever happen.
Yeah, there's a lack of acceptance or conscious acceptance or premeditated acceptance on loss in the Western culture and society in general. And when you say move, I mean, we have to move physically with it as well, because loss is not something that just happens cognitively. When we lose something, the neuroscience of loss is really what happens is a part of our brain has lost its way. It's lost the neural connections whereby I'm gonna come home, but this person that I used to see every day at 5 o'clock when I enter the house is no longer going to be there. And then we feel lost because now we're not tied to that attachment figure anymore. And so the brain scrambles neurologically to find that missing person that is no longer spatially located, and so our emotions actually are spatially located or collocated. And when we experience loss, that person now is gone. And so when we come home to an empty home, for example, that person or that pet, whatever the object of love and loss is, you are frantic. And what does a frantic child do? What it does when mom is missing or dad is missing, the attachment figure is missing. It freaks out. The child freaks out. The child screams. The child cries, and starts looking around. That's what happens to us, neurologically. And if something is such a profound process is happening neurologically, it's gonna have impacts in the body. Like, it's not just you know um contained in the mind. It goes through the entire nervous system, doesn't it?
Yeah, you're absolutely correct. And the word that really stands out for me is this concept of movement and, you know, moving through grief. Like, it's a concept that we would use, but we generally are thinking about, oh, okay, I'm going to go through this emotional progression, and you've got
Mm,
stages of grief, of denial. And, so they're often, I'm going to move through these behaviors or these thoughts or these emotional experiences. But what we often overlook is the literality, literally this idea of being moved by grief or by loss. And it doesn't just, we're not talking just about loss of a person or a pet. It could be loss of identity or loss of a job or a relationship. I mean, there's all different sorts
mm,
of things. But that in the neurology of the body, first and foremost, our defensive responses are about creating movement. There's a movement element. Like, even if someone says, I'm having an emotional experience, well, what you're experiencing is the movement of energy through the body. But, if you're crying, your diaphragm is moving up and down, your shoulders are going up and down, the facial muscles are contracting into a certain pattern. And we often overlook the primacy of the body and movement in relation to, a lot of stuff in life, but especially around grief and trauma. So when we start to recognize that, I like to use the term grief is a verb. So rather than thinking
mm,
about grief as a noun, oh, it's something that's stuck inside me, or, it's this conceptual thing, it's actually, okay, grieving is an active process, and it's not just cognitively done, but what we mean by that is there's movement in the body. The most classic way of expressing grief, of course, is going to be crying. So that there's sound coming
mm,
through the throat, the diaphragm's going to be moving, the face will be, facial muscles will all be effective. So when I say movement, I don't just mean about movement of the body through space, like walking or moving your arms, but movement within all the internal systems of the body, the diaphragm, the respiratory system, the heart pulsing more fully, all the musculature of the body is involved in the expression of grief as a way to help us integrate that loss so that we become, our physiology in our body becomes back to a state of more calmness and acceptance, that this situation is different. Like you say, you come back to an empty house, and rather than the body necessarily just automatically going into the expression of sadness and grief, over time we start to integrate that, and this becomes, this is our new world. We've still got those memories,
mm,
but physiologically, our body, when we're sort of moving through grief, eventually we're getting to those states where it's not triggering off those massive, overwhelming emotional, physiological, and movement-based responses.
mm. And If you don't mind, I'd like to share some of my experiences during psychedelic journeys, as I have experienced some profound grief in my life. My memory through these journeys, when grief overwhelms me during the trip, what happens is I'd be sobbing, and I'm always, almost always in fetal position.
Mm,
What tells me, just, it's quite obviously what it tells me is that, yes, this is the loss of an attachment figure, and therefore I'm in a fetal position because I've lost, um, like a parental figure of some form, or something that someone that gives me that sort of agapic love, and I'm self-soothing as though I would be in the womb, and I'm sobbing, and there's a lot of like movement of up and down,
mm.
um, and it's always on the side as well. And I wonder what your take is on that.
Yeah, well, one of the fascinating things around the use of psychedelics, which is really blossoming at the moment, is that primarily what it involves is a release of the ego or the conscious controlling, part of our mind to allow, and we often again focus on the emotional experience, but the emotional experience is coming along with the underlying movements of the body. So, you know, going into a fetal position, there's a contraction there. There's a protective
Mm,
element. There can also be, as you say, links back to a place of it doesn't have to be defensive. It can be, this feels safe because in utero I felt safe. Like, again, we don't need to necessarily analyze it too much. But the key thing is that what the psychedelics allowing is taking our cognitive controlling ego, or conscious mind, for want of a term, it's taking that out of the way, loosening our ego so that our body can actually move and connect us with often patterns that are unresolved or we haven't been able to experience or integrate. And it's not just about, this is the key thing, it's not just about going back to connect with those unintegrated traumatic or overwhelming experiences. It's less about the body going, I need to go back into a fetal position and contract and hold myself. It's often that's part of it, but the reason why the body's doing that is so that it can reconnect with that unresolved
mm,
experience in a physiological level, but more importantly, so that then it can move from that contracted, defended, painful place, and then go on the journey and literally start to move itself back to freedom and relaxation. So it's
mhm,
less about contacting them, and it's incredibly useful to contact those movement patterns that then are often associated with an emotional experience and also often a story or a content or a narrative. But it's not just about contacting them, it's about allowing the body to contact the depth of that contraction, for want of a better word, in order for the body to then naturally start to move itself back out of that contraction, which is, the resolution at a physiological level. And it often involves, crying, could be laughing,
mhm,
could be shaking, it could be trembling. And this is what we see with a lot of psychedelic work, where the body will and the nervous system will go through a discharge or a down regulation through, spontaneous shaking, trembling, sometimes quite violent, protective sort of
mhm.
movements. But the critical thing is not about so much, yeah, again, linking back to the trauma or the memory or the overwhelm. It's about giving the body the opportunity to move through those spontaneous movements and potentially spontaneous emotional experiences that when we have our conscious mind and our ego in control, we generally don't want to go there, and often we can't even access it because we're so used to avoiding that and controlling and not letting our body have the freedom to express itself in those moments.
So it's about being able to access them and then flow through them to get to the other side.
Absolutely, to flow through them is a great concept where you're going, look, I'm not doing this. I'm allowing my body to respond, or you might even, I might say the concept of being flowed through it. So it's like, oh wow, I'm not even doing it,
Mm,
I'm not doing the flowing. And, the classic example could be that, if we start to talk about a loss, so if I think about my mother or my father who've passed away, then, we can talk about that and I can share that story. But what's often left behind is the emotional and the physiological movements that happen in the body when we're talking about it. So, talk therapy is a fantastic way of making contact with these, unresolved grief, unresolved trauma. But what's critical is we need to allow the body's spontaneous or neurogenic or autonomic response to those memories and to that story. So if we tell the story, but we don't allow the discharge or the release to happen in the body, then we'll be telling the same story over and over again. Whether it's about the person we got divorced from or something that happened that we weren't happy about. And so it's what we're talking about here is allowing the body's natural, spontaneous movement response to discharge, which, as a young child, something happens, we cry. The diaphragm starts to move spontaneously and organically. We have crying yoga and laughing yoga to help us access that.
Mm.
But ultimately, it's about allowing the body to do what it naturally does in order to help us move through and resolve the sort of protective containment or the shock element or the bracing so that we can still breathe more fully with this new awareness of, okay, that person's no longer here in a live living 3D space, so that our body is able to restore itself back to a place of safety or comfort or calm in this new reality.
Well, you talked about laughter just now quite briefly. Is the physiology of crying and laughter linked, similar? How do they differ just physiologically?
Yeah, so on some way, I like the concept of, they're at often opposite ends of the same stick.
Mm.
Physiologically and in terms of movement, they're probably almost identical. And the only difference is the context or the meaning that we are attributing to the movement. So it's very common during TRE, for example, that people will go into a spontaneous laughter, especially in a group setting where in our culture we often don't grieve and we don't cry, and we often contain and hold that in. And so it's more comfortable, more safe to allow the diaphragm to release through laughter. And sometimes there's a story to that, or there's something funny, and oftentimes there's nothing apart from just I'm laughing and there's this organic discharge. So on some level, again, when we look at it from a purely a movement-based
Hmm.
model, in a way, it doesn't really matter whether you're laughing uncontrollably or you're crying uncontrollably. The diaphragm is still getting that level of release, and that's where either or, you're probably going to have a pretty similar resolution, whether it is laughing or crying, unless there's an element where we're consciously not allowing ourselves to cognitively integrate the loss. Um, and we have those sayings like, if you don't laugh, if you don't laugh, you're going to cry. So
Mm.
physiologically, they're both incredibly useful. And that sort of, it links a little bit, Amira, to the difference between grief and shock, where in grief, there's generally a natural pulsation in the organism, in our body, where we'll go through times of deep contraction and suffering and physical and emotional pain, but then at other times we'll go into sort of expansive movement and joy and celebration and memory and great happiness, or this pulsation between the grief or the gratitude. And that's one of my favorite sayings is, grief and gratitude are opposite ends of the same stick.
Mm.
And for most of my life, I'm someone who would cry very easily. And for most of my life, I always just thought that was grief, like even, just that was always about grief, until one day I had an extraordinary experience where I'd been involved in a men's gathering on this beautiful piece of land down near Phillip Island in Victoria. And anyway, after a number of years of holding this men's gathering on this land, the organising committee, we needed to move away because we needed a bigger venue. So that was
Mhm.
totally wonderful. But when I organised a group of us to go back to this land at Grantville, and there was a particular labyrinth that I'd had a strong association with, and
Mhm.
we were going back to sort of give gratitude for the land, clean it up a little bit, as a way of saying goodbye. And for me, when it was my turn to share, I was just bawling my eyes out. And just because it was such an over, so heartfelt connection with this land. And at the end of my sharing, I said something like, "Oh, I'm sorry. There I go. Just all full of grief and suffering and sadness." And one of the other men there, he looked at me with a bit of surprise and he said, "Oh, were you feeling grief then? I thought you were feeling gratitude the whole time." And this was a major
Mm.
aha moment for me where all of a sudden I realized that, wow, when I'm feeling gratitude, like I often say, if I'm not crying, I'm not really feeling the depths of my gratitude in my heart. And it was a complete paradigm, sort of one of those quantum leap moments where instead of going, wow, crying is only about sadness and grief, overwhelming joy and love and gratitude, for me at least, gives me the exact same experience of just, joyous crying. But again, in our culture, it's generally seen as something that means it's wrong, it's bad. If something needs to be fixed, I need support, rather than, oh, dive into that crying as heart-opening experience of gratitude as well as grief.
Not wanting to be too unnecessarily analytical, just based from your story, what's coming up for me is that the word awe, AWE, it seems to me that awe is the overarching theme whereby it can be negative emotions and positive emotions, but when you're in awe, crying and laughter is experienced. And the deeper you go, you have things like grief and gratitude. Does that make sense in any way? Or am I over conceptualizing it?
Well, oh, look, I certainly think that that feeling of what you're saying, that feeling of awe, is there's almost like this all-consuming experience. And
Mm.
in a sense, it's all-consuming in that it's an organic experience. I'm not thinking it. I'm not making it happen.
Mhm.
I'm not doing it consciously. It's like we are, swept up in, I don't necessarily like the
Mhm.
term. It's like we're carried by, or our body and our heart and our mind is being filled with a certain experience. And I would completely agree that it could be, you know, grief where there's just uncontrollable sobbing and crying, or it could be gratitude where there's uncontrollable sobbing and crying.
Mhm.
And as a male, often where we've been taught to, suppress the emotions, the classic thing is like, oh, it's going to crack me open if I'm, talking about one of my children, my daughter or something. When I'm feeling that overwhelming love, often there's the crying. And again, for me, I know in the past, some men's work sort of things I've done, they'll be saying, oh, well, you're only crying because that's actually, yes, you're connecting gratitude, but it's because of your unresolved grief in the moment. So I used to think about it like that for a little while, whereas these days, for me at least, my experience and my belief very much is, as I say, if I'm not crying my heart out, then I'm not actually as deeply connected to my gratitude as I possibly can be, without necessarily having to have any sort of story around it being a reflection of grief at all. For me, that's just that is the experience, that the experience of gratitude is the same level of depth of crying and heart open crying as there is with grief.
That's so beautiful. Thank you so much for sharing that. That's so insightful. Thank you, Richmond.
Yeah. And,
And
and
mm,
can I just add this, Amira? It's just coming to me as we're speaking now.
yeah.
A way for me of thinking about that is when I'm in grief, the crying is almost associated with a letting go, something that's like leaving my body. But, not necessarily as an entity, but it's like there was something that I was connected to, and now I'm letting go of it. And the gratitude is very similar, but in the opposite direction, where there's almost something
Ah.
getting more connected to. So again, when we're talking about this concept of movement, rather than looking at it psycho-emotionally, I'm going, right, there's this movement, and the grief movement is a feeling of something's, yeah, as I say, letting go, and the gratitude is something it's like leaving out of me, and the gratitude is there's this sense of movement of something coming into me that I'm connected with. Now, both of those things are probably already deeply residing inside me, but yeah, that feeling of connecting more deeply, something coming into connection versus something moving away from connection.
You know, Now that you've said that, I think you've articulated my last psychedelic experience quite well, because when I sank into the depths of my grief with no obstruction whatsoever, I saw the love for what it was. And then I sank into gratitude. And then for the following week, when I was doing my meditation and just, meditative readings, for example, this was yesterday actually. I was sitting and I was meditating, I was reading, and I believe I was reading something from the Bhagavad Gita, and then followed by one of Socrates', I think, prayers. And he was talking about love and beauty. And I just started crying.
Mm.
And my husband was studying, and he looked up and he's like, "Oh no, what's wrong?" And he came and gave me a cuddle, and I'm like, "No,"
Yeah.
because after I was able to find my voice, I'm like, I'm just crying because of love. Because
Mm.
that's what grief is. Grief is the price you pay for love. And when I sunk to the depths of grief, processing through all that, on the other side, I felt love and gratitude. And I could not have gotten to that point if I didn't sink down and touch the floor of the grief itself. That makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. And what a what a profound and amazing experience. And there is that reality of, a way I often think about it is around our boundaries of, literally our physical boundaries, a bit like a cell wall. It's like what we're letting in and
Mhm.
the depth that we connect to. And yeah, and like just that heart opening, there's an openness in the system, um, so that when you connect on that level, whether it's through grief, and often, we go through trauma and grief that's really cracks us open and opens us up in a way that often trying to consciously create gratitude often doesn't get to, because there's a still an element of control. And that's where, that
Mhm.
depth of trauma and grief, where we're going, I don't want this, I've got no control over it. It somehow manages to open us in a very profound and often, as you experience, often a deeper way. And if we just think about, right, this is opening up the channels wider, and allowing more to move towards me or out of me or in and out of me, um,
Mhm.
in the same way that, wow, we're allowing ourselves to contact more grief and loss and sadness and further contraction. At the same time, the opposite's true. It's allowing us to also contact much greater openness and connection and attachment and joy.
And that release, I guess, of control, to allow ourselves to get to where it needs to go, comes with humility. Like, it is a humbling experience to lose all control and sink so far and
Mm,
then come back up. And it's almost like you gotta trust the process, which, when you were talking about the flow of grief going outwards and gratitude coming inwards, I'm also reminded of the fact that if we think that we are a self-governing organism, right, then we relinquish the idea that we can also operate as a conduit through of these energies and these flows. And life events that happen to us need to happen through us as well. So I wonder what you think about the idea that we're, as organic vessels, we are also conduit to the expression of emotion through time. A bit of a zoom out perspective, but I'd like to hear your thoughts on that.
can you clarify, what you mean a bit there in terms of the expression of emotion?
So in terms of the expression of emotion would be through grief and gratitude, like what you talked about with your experience with the men's group,
Mm,
allowing that to flow out and then gratitude to flow back in.
mm.
So in a sense that we are just kind of a vessel, a conduit for these emotions to run through us if we allow for that to happen in order for us to get back to a harmonious state.
So, I mean, I think one of the great gifts of a lot of Indigenous cultures around the world, and certainly my experience of various Indigenous peoples in Australia, is very much this capacity to connect with the land or country. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and rather than in the Western sort of model, it's like, oh, well, that's an inanimate object, or the tree doesn't have consciousness, or the land doesn't have any sort of consciousness. And certainly, in my experiences and teachers, Indigenous elders and teachers of mine, is that sense of connecting with the land, very much can become an expression of the land's, in human form as the emotions. So, people might be
Mm.
feeling the grief of the land and the grief that's associated with the land in certain areas, rather than only thinking of it as this is my grief. And I think that's
Mm.
very much a symptom of the Western, very individualistic psychological sort of model that we've evolved, where it's like all mental health is happening inside you, it's inside your brain,
Mm.
only you, and it's taking out of context and community. So I'm not sure if that answers. I'm not sure exactly if that answers the question, or if you've got a different angle on the question.
No, it does answer the question to an extent. I just never thought of that perspective. And now that you've explained that, shared grief is one of the ways to get through them, to get through grief, shared mourning, shared grief. And often we connect people to support systems like who can you talk to, right? When there's grief and
Mm,
loss or trauma involved, who can you talk to that's safe and trusted? And
mm,
I might move on to a slightly different topic here, but oftentimes, not oftentimes, sometimes the people that is part of our mourning community or committee, you would say, people who share the same loss in the case of bereavement, for example, where you lose someone to death, they may not be the best people to be able to support you, and there might be tensions within the family or the cultural ties that you have with each other may not be as harmonious as you would expect to. So sometimes that can cause complicated grief or prolonged grief.
mm,
But generally, what we do is we help people connect with their loved ones or close ones that can help support them through grief, because grief is not something you're supposed to get through on your own. However, with TRE, you talk about releasing that tension, and that is something that you can do individually or with the help of a physiotherapist trained in TRE. Can you tell us a little bit more about how you would induce
mm,
that tremor? Because I mean, if it's hard for somebody to access it, even psychologically or mentally, how would you even be able to,
mm.
spontaneously access it physically?
So it's very simple to access. We literally just use a muscle activation or a muscle load. So often in TRE, people are lying on their backs with their feet in like a diamond shape,
Oh,
and then lifting the knees up. So you're using the inner thigh muscles, but you can actually use any muscle group. And so, one of the beauties of this technique is that we are bypassing the conscious mind and the story. Not to say there's not value in the story and the narrative, but we're going directly to the physiology of the body. And most people will find that within a minute or two, they will be able to connect with and feel that shaking and trembling in the muscle groups that they've activated. And just to be clear, it's not, you don't have to be a physio to learn this. There are TRE providers around the world in about 80 countries of vast different backgrounds. And so by activating the spontaneous movements first and then allowing them to spread, then often they will move up through the deep muscles in the lumbar spine, the psoas muscle, and eventually into the diaphragm or anywhere throughout the body. So that's where what we're doing there is enabling and empowering people. And one of the reasons I'm passionate about TRE, Amira, is that you can learn how to connect with this natural response that's already inside us. So it's not like a technique or a modality per se. It's a way of framing how do we deliberately access and connect with and allow this spontaneous movement to occur. And very much, again, what I love about it is you're not necessarily dependent upon having to see a therapist or have someone else have the knowledge and the wisdom that you can learn to use this on your own. At the same time, I want to pick up a little bit about what you said about it doesn't have to be used individually. And a lot of what happens is it will depend on our cultural context. So in the Western culture, a lot of us do want to use it on our own and not have lots of people around. And often in other cultures, it's the complete opposite, where people want to have other people around and where they're living more communal, community-based life, they will often tremor together. And what's a fascinating sort of parallel that I like to use is that if you take singing as an example, now I can sing in the shower and it's great acoustics and I have a great time. And when I sing with other people, oh, it's fantastic because you've got all those connections and it's fun and you can play around. But there's also the reality that when we sing in harmony, it's not just 1 + 1 = 2. Different notes and resonances are created in our singing and in literally in the sounds and the sound waves that we cannot create on our own. So we still have our own voice, we still have the other's voice, but now there's this other resonance or harmonic that gets created that can't happen on its own. Now, the reason I use this analogy is when we have people tremoring and shaking together in a group, a similar thing happens where there is literally a resonance in the physiology of the body, whether you want to talk about, the energetic field or the movement response, as long as being in a group is comfortable for us, where often what happens is more movement or more depth of movement or more letting go or more reorganizing or more freedom of movement and expression often happens in a group environment than we get on our own. Now, if being in a group is scary and dangerous, and again, in our culture, then it's quite fascinating is if we have a group of people lying on the floor and they're all tremoring and one person starts to laugh out loud, then generally what happens is the person next to them laughs and the next person, and there's a spread of this ripple of laughter and people go into
Infectious laughter. Yeah.
infectious laughter. Now, in Western culture, when someone is in a group, if they start to cry, we very rarely have infectious crying. Generally, what happens is everybody's body takes a big breath, they hold, they're looking at the person thinking, what's wrong? What's the story? What happened? What do we need to do to help them? Because culturally, we don't go, oh, wow, there's someone crying. What a great chance for some infectious crying. So I can actually cry and grieve and let my body express grief or gratitude to the same level. So even though I'm, really passionate about people learning how to use this shaking and tremoring, not just for grief, but in all aspects of life for well-being and mental health and coming alive and expression and becoming more embodied and, healing pain, all sorts of different stuff. But there is this huge value and potential when we use that in a collective group, including when we come together to grieve. And, sadly, I think in our Western culture, and the funerals I've been to generally, if you're asking about the people who've lost someone, we're going, how were they at the funeral or at the burial? They're like, oh, they were good. They were really strong, which basically means they weren't crying. We were all standing around trying to prevent crying, trying to prevent grieving. And it's that containment of the movements and the expressions, including the emotional, including the sound, that in our Western culture, we generally don't grieve very well. And there's an amazing Indigenous woman from somewhere in South Australia that we would call it now. I don't remember the name of her country or her people, Rosemary Wanganeen, who has started an organization or an institution or a movement which is called griefology, where literally, you know, she's going, in Australian mainstream culture, we've lost the art of grieving and the value of grieving and how to do it and how to understand it and how to embrace it and how to support and how to move through it collectively, which you know, Rosemary talks about that a lot of the traditional cultures in this land, in Australia at least, but I think also all around the world, have a huge amount for us to learn and share and, you know, gain and benefit from, in terms of integrating grief, not just the experience of grief, but the moving through the grief, and also the collective expression and engagement with grief as well. And Rosemary's
Yeah, I'm
got,
glad.
there's a great webinar, like a great podcast. I can't remember the name of it, but I think if you look up Rosemary Wanganeen Griefology, you'll probably be able to find a link to. Yeah, it's a amazing talk that she gives, an amazing process, amazing wisdom.
Hey guys, thank you so much for tuning in to Science of the Soul. This is a short interruption to let you know that if you or someone you know are in need of more support, you can find me at Road to Recovery on my Facebook page, my Instagram, or my website at aroadtorecovery.org. I hope you've enjoyed listening so far, and now let's get back to the podcast. But I really did like how you've just branched off into the collective experience, because a lot of us in the Western society, we're just way too individualistic. Not to
Mm,
say there's anything wrong with, being an individual, but we do miss out on the depth and the breadth of a lot of the human experience when we're isolated and when we keep to ourselves. So it is much appreciated that you bring that up, because for my thesis, what I did was also to examine how mourning took place in funeral cultures as well, particularly around the Islamic faith. And they're generally similar amongst Muslims, but there are some variations from country to country, culture to culture. But then if you broaden that as well, you can see that many, many cultures have wakes, and during the wakes, people come and go. No one's the grieving family itself, they're not completely isolated all the time. I mean, sometimes, yes, they can retreat and have some space and time to themselves. Often they don't get that until the wake is over, and then they have a
mm,
different stage of grief that that happens, that
mm,
needs to happen as well. But people will come and go and cry with them and laugh with them and talk about the memories and play games, gamble. I think gambling's a really big thing, not for the Muslim culture, but for other cultures. There's a lot of gambling involved. There's singing, there's dancing for some cultures as well. So they
mm,
really do go through all the different emotional expressions together,
mm,
um, of love, really, because again, grief is the price you pay for love. So of love for the person that has passed on. Um, they're just celebrating and being sad at the same time, all at once and at different points, with everybody and with nobody. So that's something beautiful in that chaotic um interplay and interaction during the wake, which might maybe 3 days, 7 days, 14 days, however long that
mm.
it is.
Yeah, that's right, and it's built into the cultural experience. You know, there's rituals, as you say, and processes
Mhm.
which are about, you know, moving through grief and being moved. So, as you say, all the expression, the singing, the dancing, and the pulsation between the sorrow and the celebration. You know, all of those things, and it's a great loss in our Western culture. I really, you know, I think it's a incredibly limiting way that we tend to, we don't really process it often. We try to avoid grief and grief.
Mm. Yeah, and we reward the suppression of vulnerability. Like you were not vulnerable. That's great. You know, you're strong, you're brave, but it really is the opposite of that. I remember, look, I haven't been to very many Western funerals in my life, and the one that I went to, which was probably 5 years ago, I'd say 6 years, 5 to 6 years ago, there was hardly any tears, and I felt so confused and out of place. It was just awkward for me, and I wasn't a family member, but none of the family members really shed a tear openly, and I thought that was really weird. It just felt awkward. Like, how come no one is crying? Why are they all just drinking and smiling and being like normal, like nothing really happened?
Mm. Yep. I completely, I completely agree with you. Such a strange, wounded, I would say, cultural suppression of that reality. And I like what you were saying before, Amira, around that sense of humility. And part of humility is going, wow, there is things bigger than ourselves. There is life bigger than myself. And so much of the Western culture is around, as you say, control, staying in control, which is really about my ego. And again, there's nothing wrong, and it's a great skill to be able to be stoic and put aside our emotions in order to do
Mm,
a job. If everyone falls apart as soon as there's a car crash and everyone's crying for 3 days, well, then people aren't going to get saved. They're not going to get to hospital. So there is
mm,
capacity to be stoic. It's just hugely, as you say, hugely over focused on. And
mm,
that's symbolic. If I look at my sort of, white Anglo-Saxon Western Australian culture, there's not a lot of humility in the culture. There is a sense of, and I think a lot of it comes out of, that Christian background belief around, the earth is there to serve us and we're in charge. And so keeping grief and trauma and loss, keeping it at bay, it actually helps us, you know, stay in a sense of control and actually lose humility or humbleness and, a sense of what I think is a much more mature and wise sense of self and ego of, we've got this limited power that we need to use well, but we're also so tiny in the big scope of the world and the universe and life and time. And I think the Western culture reflects in many ways that lack of humility, over focus on ourselves and our own needs rather than that cultural relationship with the earth and, the importance of other people, other cultures, other races,
mm,
and the earth. And, for me, the hope is that we're at a stage in cultural evolution in the Western world where, like a maturing, going through teenagehood or young adulthood, and it's a phase and a process of growth that hopefully
mm.
we'll move through.
Yeah.
And dare I say it, part of that comes with a grieving or a letting go of, I want to be in charge of everything. It's all about me. In the same way that as a teenager moving into adulthood, there's things we need to let go of and to grieve and release in order to mature. I'm kind of
I
off on a
love that.
on a big scope, different topic now, but
Yeah.
I just think, yeah, this whole element around grief and
Mm,
trauma, as you say, you raise that sense of humility and a little bit more reverence and respect for things outside ourselves and things,
mm.
people, country, land, animals, other cultures, really everything, the environment.
Yeah, we start to enter a more transcendental headspace, look at this quite deeply. And to be honest, there is no trauma without grief. With every traumatic event that happens, whether you lost someone you love or not, there is a sense of loss because oftentimes there's a loss of innocence, or there's a loss of the fact that you had this assumption of the world, the way the world is, your specific individual worldview, and or the one that you inherited through culture or religion or from your parents. And now it doesn't serve you. Like, say, for example, bad things only happen to bad people, bad things don't happen to good people. And then, grief happens to us. We have it's not a voluntary thing that we seek, it
Mm.
happens to us. We have no agency. And that's where the humility um is required, because if you don't have that already developed or inculcated or somewhere at the back of your mind, that shit happens to you, that then you will struggle with the fact that bad things can happen to good people. This is an example of
Mm.
a worldview that doesn't serve many of us, and a very naive worldview as well.
Mm.
um and then when you go through that being shattered, which means you're going through a form of loss or grief, and then you realize, like, oh, you know like, now I'm also grieving of the innocent days, or the days where I thought
Mm.
that life was a certain way, or this was my worldview, or this was my assumption.
Mm.
And with that comes an existential crisis, potentially, if the loss and the trauma is large enough. And I wonder, maybe you can speak to this, maybe you cannot. You did say that TRE is a way to kind of bypass the narrative for the body to heal. Um, and I'm thinking of EMDR when you say that, because it is a modality where you can process trauma through, eye movement, and not really going into the narrative of the event. I
Mm.
wonder, just based from your experience, again, if you can speak to it, if the loss triggers an existential or a spiritual crisis, what is TRE's role in resolving, or not even resolving, but helping us move through that? Because some element of narrative meaning reconstruction of the world still has to happen. But
Mm.
what is the role of the body,
Mm.
that?
Yeah, so there's so many things that you've sort of touched upon there, Amira. So the first thing I would just want to start with is the difference between kind of grief or shock. And I'll never forget Maggie Klein, who is one of the sort of senior teachers in somatic experiencing, author of some fantastic book, Trauma Through a Child's Eyes, that she'd co-written with Peter Levine, at a
Mm,
workshop in Australia one time, and she talked specifically about this. It's like you can't have sort of shock, you can't have trauma or shock or without grief, but you can have grief
mm,
without shock and trauma. And by
mm,
that meaning, that often what we think of as grief is the containment of grief. It's the shock, it's the immobility. Um, and it's the lack of allowing the body to express, to prevent that shattering on a physiological level. And the example in my own life was that my mother-in-law passed away completely unexpectedly, in the mid 60s. And not only was all this grief around for her family and extended family, but there was a huge amount of shock because it just happened completely out of the blue. So, we
mm,
go into that immobilized, stuck. Yeah, everything's just it's such a huge, massive impact that it's like the body can't integrate it out. Our psyche and our body can't integrate it. And then sadly, my sister-in-law, my mother-in-law's daughter, she passed away a number of years ago, again due to brain cancer. And there was still the
mm,
sadness and the grief, but the journey towards that was, happened over a number of years. And so in that point,
mm,
there was a whole lot of grieving and sorrow and sadness, but because it wasn't so fast and that, it's like there was less shock, or there was less
mm,
immobility. So that's something. And then when we talk about, being able to integrate it, or that existential sort of the existential shock that comes along with us, and that loss of innocence. So, whenever there's sort of a trauma, there's going to be a loss of innocence there. Um,
mm,
I always recall Dr. David Berselli, the TRE founder, many years ago when I brought him out to Australia, and talked at length about belief systems. And so exactly what you say, we often have belief
mm,
systems that are absolutely okay, and they're going to protect us and serve us well when things are going well. Things like good things happen to good people. So if I'm a good person, everything's good's going to happen. Or, I believe in karma. I'm doing the right thing. I'm not going to be in trouble because I'm doing the right thing. Or, a religious concept. I'll pray to my God will look after me. And so that keeps us functioning. And then when trauma happens, our belief systems get shattered. Like, oh, wow, I've been doing the right thing and something bad's happened. My child's died. I've been praying to my God and God hasn't protected me. And then I remember him so clearly. It was such a revelation. He talked about this because he'd been working in trauma in all different sorts of cultural and religious settings. And he talked about how often what happens when we get a shattering of these belief systems, that a couple of things might happen. One is that people often double down in their belief systems. So they don't let it shatter them. So for me, my parents were Roman Catholics. So, it was like, yeah, you pray to God, God's going to look after you. And then when something bad happens, the statement would be, God works in mysterious ways. So rather than saying, hang on, my belief here hasn't kept me safe, we will integrate it. And so what David noticed around the world was a lot of people would double down. So they go, well, it happened because I'm not praying hard enough. I've got to do more. The other thing he noticed was that other people would often lose their or completely shatter their belief systems and they would just move away. So they'd stop believing in God or their religion or their whatever it was, or they would commonly also pick up a different religion. So they might swap from being a Christian to a Buddhist or from a Buddhist to Christianity and take on a new belief system as a way of trying to, protect ourselves. And then he also noticed there were other people, though, and this is where in the field of psychology we talk about post-traumatic growth, or let's suggest, I haven't heard the term, but we should have a term post-grief growth. Again, that's kind of what griefology and Rosemary Wanganeen are talking about, where there were people who allowed that shattering of their belief system to actually grow and evolve their belief systems, so that there was often a little bit more opening to, wow, how do I integrate trauma into my belief system? There is a great mystery, there's a maturity. I'm going to die. And often this doesn't happen to us until we're a lot older. That then leads us to appreciate life a lot more. And one of the things David Berceli said, really clearly, and I hadn't really ever heard people say this before, was the belief system is in the body. It's not just
Oh.
a it's not just a psycho-emotional construct or a concept that lives separate to a body, but it's actually part of our body and our being. So the deliberate use of the neurogenic tremors or the spontaneous movements, what I see is it doesn't just free up the physiology and the muscle tension in the body, but on some level, as our defensive, protective, resistance, controlling um, patterns play out in the physiology of the body, as they start to soften and let go, and our body starts to open up and become more, not just vulnerable, but more engaged with the experience, and less contraction and defense, that often our belief system will often evolve and expand and open as well. So, as we
Wow.
allow our body to come back to a calm place of, I'm here, I'm okay in the moment, we have a lot more freedom than psycho-emotionally or intellectually or mentally to open to this new reality, because the body's, naturally as a child, our body is going to engage with whatever the experience is and explore and move forwards. And we often sort of harden up our belief systems and we get more narrow and rigid. So as we soften the physiology, as the shaking and the tremoring takes us sort of, through a polyvagal model of the nervous system back to a more ventral vagal engaged state with our experience, then naturally we're more open and curious rather than fixated and narrow. So I think it has, the potential to play a huge role in helping us grow into a more humble and a more curious and mystery-filled sense of belief, where we learn to incorporate the great mystery or integrate the great mystery of life and the great unknown, rather than only feeling safe and secure because I know everything in my belief systems, whether that's religious or spiritual. That's what's keeping me that's what's keeping me safe here and now, because it means I can believe everything's going to be okay. It helps me avoid right now having to deal with the fact of, everyone's going to die probably. So, it's often a way of keeping things at bay.
That's so interesting, and it makes so much sense. And I guess that's the other thing about religious practices or just philosophical practices. It lies in the word practice, is because when you do these routines or rituals religiously, so routinely, you your body is learning how to cope with things, right? And I guess that kind of ties into what you've just talked about in terms of allowing the body to, yeah, allowing giving the body the opportunity to physiologically get through the shock that it needs to get through so that other things, so that your mind can be calmer for you to integrate a new narrative or reconstruct a new narrative. Did I get that correctly?
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. Because, you know, for, again, it's for want of better concepts, our mind and our body, or our ego or our consciousness or our cognitive thoughts, it works both ways. We can think certain
Yeah.
things and generate a response in the body, but more often than not, and especially around stress and trauma and grief, the responses are happening first of all in our organism, in our physiology, in
Mm,
our body and neuromuscular system, and the state of our nervous system then is reflected by our thinking. So,
mm.
if I'm incredibly anxious and I'm thinking anxious thoughts, well, yes, absolutely. If I
Your
choose
cortisol will go up and everything would
that,
tighten up.
that's right. Now, if I choose to think about being scared and I choose to deliberately think things that make me scared, well, then that's going to make my physiology in my body start to feel scared. But
Mm,
almost none of
mm,
us are consciously choosing, I want to have these thoughts. I want to feel scared, or I want to feel angry, or I want to feel overwhelmed. The physiology of the body, our mind and our thinking is, I like to describe it as like the bubbles on the kettle boiling off. It's reflecting generally, and more often not, that what our underlying physiology is. So that
mm,
when I'm thinking anxious thoughts, it's because my physiology is in a flight mode. It's designed to make me feel
mm,
scared and to
It's like a
think scared.
feedback response, exactly.
Correct. So this is why the spontaneous movement response is so valuable, is because none of us are choosing to consciously think or behave or experience overwhelm or, fear or anger. They're physiological responses first, and then our thinking is reflective of what that physiology is doing. And so there's a limit to what we can achieve when we're only ever working with ourselves cognitively or consciously, because
Yeah.
if if there wasn't a limit, we would just tell people to let it all go and be enlightened, and we'd all do that. And so this
Yeah.
is where, when we can recognize what state is the physiology of the body in, wow, if I'm feeling helpless and hopeless, it's not just because I've got helpless and hopeless thinking, although that can become sort of habituated. It's because when we are in a trauma, freeze, immobility state, our physiology is creating the physiology of hopelessness and helplessness. So we don't try to take action and escalate the situation or make it worse. So therefore, our thinking reflects our underlying physiology. So with TRE, what we're looking at, and again, TRE, Amira, is just one model of working with this, response. It's kind of trauma informed. It uses a neuroscientific level, language and lens, but ultimately all cultures around the world that have used it look at it different ways. But what we're doing is accessing the part of the nervous system, for want of a better word, or our organism or our body, the part that's generating those responses, whether they're stress, anxiety, whether it's the containment of sorrow and grief, you know, and by accessing and allowing the same parts of our nervous system that's creating those states to unwind them on them by itself, to resolve it, to move through the full cycle of protection and then release, or the shock and the release of the shock, or the fight and flight and then the down regulation and the shaking and trembling. We're adding in this other level of, a bottom-up approach of letting the body physiology change, which then has a massive impact on what our natural state is mentally. And part of that is getting back to that sort of, beginner's mind, of a childlike mind of
Mm.
naturally at our baseline, when we're not in protective physiological states, naturally at our baseline, we're like children, we're curious. I know in my
Mm.
Christian background, there was the saying, we've got to be like children to enter the gates of heaven. Well, what does that mean? It means
This is the second time today I've heard that line.
well, there you go. So it's not just about thinking like children. It's not like behaving like children. It's like getting our nervous system, for again, just a Western scientific, neuroscientific model. It's getting our state, our physiology, our body, our organism, our energy field into that state, which is naturally curious and open and engaging of life, of all the experiences of life, both the
Yeah.
sorrow as well as the celebration, the grief as well as the gratitude, and being able to engage and have that experience in all the humanness that we experience, rather than in states where we're protective, our physiology is defensive, it's shut down, it's trying to contain the full human experience. Because when we shut down the sorrow, we shut down the celebration. When we shut down the grief, then the body can't express at the same level of gratitude. So we miss out on the full catastrophe, or the full human experience. So that's where the spontaneous movements that we work with in TRE through a neuroscientific lens is about helping the body naturally let go of that armoring patterns that happen in the physiology, to get us back to that more childlike physiological state, where naturally our thinking, our emotional experience is curious and engaged and exploratory in the world, with a great mystery ahead of us, rather than feeling safe and secure because we know we can control everything and we know what's going to happen, and we can take steps to make sure that we only ever experience what we choose to experience.
Yeah, because if you take that perspective in life, then you're not playing with life, you're not engaging entirely and fully, and so you miss out on the extent of the human experience through its wonders and its woes. Uh,
That's right. We miss out on the vitality and the
mm,
aliveness. And, again, I live in Australia. So in my Western culture, there are very few people who I see who are vitally alive, like who are just fully alive and awakened to the moment. So I think
mm,
it's a great sorrow that so many of us don't have that, and we sort of trudge through life, and you earn the money to build the
mm,
house and get safe and do all those sort of things. And it's not to discount the value of those, but I think there's a huge amount of vitality and aliveness that, me
mm,
included, me as much as anyone, culturally, that we miss and miss out. And there's a great documentary called the Dance. I think, I can't remember whether it's Dances of Ecstasy or the Dance of Ecstasy. And
uh-huh.
around, again, in a lot of traditional cultures, like if you look at the Sufi practice and the whirling dervishes, or if you look
Oh,
at the
yeah.
Kalahari Bushmen, or you look at rhythm and dance and trance dancing,
Mm.
and the experience of people feeling the vitality and
That
aliveness,
euphoria, and that often also
the
happens
ecstasy.
in a group setting as well. I mean, why do you think raves are so popular?
Absolutely. And, I think about raves, I often talk about in my culture when I grew up, which was when I was younger, it was much more in an alcohol filled rather than sort of, psychedelics and that sort of thing. But I
Mm-hmm.
often say, part of the alcohol was like the ego loosening device, that it
Mm-hmm.
takes away some of the inhibitions, and then wow, all of a sudden I can dance because I haven't got all my insecurities, and so there's this aliveness and vitality. It's
Mm-hmm.
just that that's not done in a sacred manner to use alcohol as a sacred substance. It's more just getting really drunk. But it's about that sense of allowing the vitality which is within us to express itself. And again, coming full circle around to grief, this is really what we're talking about. Grief as a verb, grief as an experience, and allowing the grief to literally move us, whether that's through sound and wailing or crying, or the shuddering, or whatever movements want to spontaneously move through us. And one of the great opportunities as most of us have experienced, is it's often the grief which opens our heart most fully and shatters that armoring and protecting that we have physiologically in our muscular system, but around our heart, literally in the fascia and the pericardium around our heart, and that holding and containment. It often takes that life and death experience and that overwhelming trauma and
Mhm.
grief to shatter that protection. And as painful as that is, it also creates a crack in the wall, or a little gap in the armoring that also allows us to experience and feel more life. And that's really
Yeah. It's
one
like
of the greatest
reclaiming your
grief.
vitality by going through, allowing the the cracking to happen, allowing your body, the somatic systems to just take over, so that your brain can just kind of switch off and let things happen. And then in that way, you're reclaiming your life back.
Absolutely. And that's one of the gifts of grief. And for me, I'm always like to be really clear to people. And if you're listening to this, please don't take that on as a belief system. Oh, I should be thankful for this. I've got to move through it. There's just
Mm, mm,
the reality is honoring the experience in the moment, which, could be complete frustration, anger, denial,
mm.
whatever it is. So it's not about then taking on another belief system of, oh, I should be thankful that I've just
Yeah.
lost. It's about just honoring the experience in the moment, but knowing that there's a pathway towards, resolution and integration. It doesn't mean that sorrow might disappear, or you might miss people for the rest of your life, or, all sorts of things. But
Mm,
knowing that we can, if we're supported, and if we have even, a lot of us don't even have this pathway or this roadmap of saying, hey, well, let's go into the grief. Let's allow the grief to actually move us and allow it to
mm,
open up our heart. Often it's people who've had spontaneous sort of awakenings through horrendous grief experiences are the people who they go, wow, I wish this hadn't have happened. I would never wish it upon anyone. However,
mm,
I love my children more. I kiss my partner more. I'm
mm,
more passionate about my life. And so, you know, people often spontaneously have these experiences where it cracks them open, and there's this huge, grief-filled growth and openness and
mm,
loving that then transforms them and the way they live their lives. So hopefully in this discussion, and certainly I see it happening around the world, that and mainly in Western culture, we, trying to recreate this pathway or open the doorway through grief. So it's not just about recovering or getting back to where we
mm,
were, or going, I just want to feel okay now without this in my life or this person in my life, but
mm.
actually integrating it as going, this is an initiation or a process of
I
growth
like that.
and
Mm,
an evolution. One of my analogies I often use in TRE, in this process of letting go and surrendering to life moving us and affecting us, is kind of the concept of being pruned, like a little rose
mhm,
bush that's going, don't cut me, don't cut me. Oh my God, that's so traumatic. And then 6 months later, there's a beautiful rose there, but we're like, we don't realize it.
mm,
And the process keeps happening until eventually we're like, oh, I don't like the cutting off bit, but I know that that's going to actually blossom and bloom,
mm,
and something's going to grow out of it. Now, again, it's not to just go into belief systems and deny the pain of the cutting and, oh, it's all good, it's all good, it's all roses, a rose is going to come out, and as a way of avoiding that, the suffering and the sadness and the loss in our humanity. But again, simply having that model of, this is probably going to hurt, it may or may not, but being open to, there's a bigger picture, and not getting lost in, this is only a negative, this is only traumatic, it's only
mhm.
bad. Um,
Yeah.
and reinforcing that on an embodied, a real experiential level, not just a belief, not an
Mm.
intellectual belief that's trying to override the experience of
It's
grief.
is a transformation, like you said. And I wanted to just quickly circle back to what you were talking about in terms of belief systems. That's actually what some of my findings from my thesis was, whereby for some people, their faith was affirmed, and for others, especially those who had experienced more traumatic losses, they apostatized. And they would apostatize, which means to move away or move out of the religion they were born into, or the belief system that they
Mm,
inherited. They moved away from it for some years and then either come back to it with a newer appreciation of their belief system or a more expanded
Mm,
appreciation of it. Um, whereas some, not many, but some, um, actually, how do I say this? The transformation was more on the spiritual, how they position themselves in terms of their spirituality. So
mm,
maybe not so much in terms of dogma and doctrine, but
yes.
more in terms of, connection, connectedness, and all that. So post-traumatic growth, which is what you mentioned, was something that was a big chapter in my thesis because
Mm,
I talked about it, this usually happen when there is a loss. And with that comes a lot of physiological problems as well. There's a lot of health issues that people go through when they are going through traumatic loss in general, grief in
mm,
general. But when it's also traumatic, immune system really tanks. I remember when my mother passed away, I like didn't have my period for a very long time.
mm,
My hair started to fall, and yeah, my body was completely out of whack.
mm,
And it was, in response to a traumatic loss as well. And so some for our listeners, I thought I'd just talk about the post-traumatic growth and what it actually is. So it was conceptualized by Calhoun and Tedeschi, and they proposed this five-factor approach whereby with post-traumatic growth, basically it's life-enhancing growth. Um, so instead of coming out with PTSD or depression or addiction or complicated grief or prolonged grief, you're coming out. Yeah, it takes time. Not time is needed for this. This discovery of strength, the development of positive perceptions of the world and the relationships with others, kind of what you just talked about in terms of like I love my children more. I kiss my partner more intently, things like that. Making meaning from the suffering that, you've gone through, having a deeper appreciation for life. So again, that vitality concept we were talking about, and then reevaluation of priorities and new possibilities in life, and finally experiencing spiritual growth. So these are the five factors that underpin the concept of post-traumatic growth.
mm. And it's a brilliant concept. Again, I think it's always worth keeping it in context is that, post-traumatic growth has become a new sort of area of study, and it's like, someone's sort of discovering it, or people are researching it, but that's only within the context of the Western medical,
Academia,
model.
that's right.
That's right. So we sort of, there's this whole new thing. We're talking about post-traumatic growth, and a tiny percentage of people. This is this whole new field, but then you've got all these other cultures who are sitting there going, "We've been dealing
The
with this
elders are
here."
just shaking their heads. They're like, seriously,
That's
guys.
right. They're going, "You guys know, this is what our whole culture is about." And it's one of the things I loved about the work of David Berceli was,
Mm.
rather than, and again, in our Western culture, we often have in our medical model a very restorative culture. So it's like something got hurt, let me fix it so I go back to where I.
It's symptomatic. You respond to the symptoms, not to the root.
That's right. And we're just going, just what I want to do is I don't want to grow, I don't want to heal or change or evolve. I just want to fix up, get rid of the pain so I can keep doing what I was doing in the past. Now, that's very
Mm.
useful if you're playing sport. You're going, I want to be able to play at sport at a high level. But it's not necessarily so useful if you're going, how to actually mature and evolve and come into deeper relationship with the world, so more spiritual, for want of a better word,
Mm.
a more engaged and relational experience of life, rather than a more childlike or dogmatic view of religion or beliefs and that sort of thing. So it's something, again, that was built into the culture, indigenous cultures, and I would say that includes my own sort of probably primarily Celtic, background culture, where the cycles of nature involve a full cycle where there's the, the seasons of birth and death and rebirth and all that sort of thing, that in our culture, a lot of what we do in the West is we're trying to just fix things up to get them back to where they were. And David Berceli, one of the key beautiful things that he brought in terms of the use of TRE and trauma recovery or tension release was around the concept that trauma is an evolutionary impulse on the planet, including grief as well. So this concept of, rather than it's something wrong or bad, that part of what has helped humans evolve and develop and become where we are, both good and bad, is our capacity to not just recover from trauma, but to actually expand and grow through it, both physiologically, but also very much, spiritually or intellectually, in our belief systems as well. So there was two things I'll never forget, Amira, hearing on the radio one day. I can't remember, it was on ABC radio in Australia, and someone called in. They were talking about bumper stickers on cars, and someone had seen a bumper sticker that said, "Faith is to humans as sand is to ostriches." And I've never forgotten
Oh,
that
that's a
concept.
good one.
Yeah, so this sense of, if I believe hard enough, I can make myself feel good and ignore the mystery and the uncertainty. So I just think, that again, that's part of that maturing that happens over time, um, on a psycho-emotional and a level. And when I did, you mentioned in the introduction, I'd done an advanced diploma of Aboriginal Studies with an Aboriginal organisation called TRE. It was an Aboriginal college, and they allowed non-Indigenous people to do the same course, which was, a lot of it was all about identity and, our own identity. But for me, if I had to sum up what I learnt in terms of all these different Indigenous cultures in Australia, the one word that it came back to for me was relationship, about being in relationship with myself, with other people, with the animals, and with country, or, with the land around us. And that was, for me, I took away, this was the essence of their Indigenous spirituality, was this relationship, which inherently involves respect and it involves humility. And this is where I see, the process of grief links us back into this sense of humility and our connection beyond ourselves, rather than being, in a very young, immature, youthful sort of filled, I'm the center of the world, I can control everything, I've got to protect myself, and moving beyond that. And as I say, David Berceli very clear about this sense of that trauma and grief is something that helps us grow and evolve physiologically, but also in terms of our belief, our relationships with the world and life around us.
That's a beautiful, beautiful place to close, actually.
I think we've covered some pretty broad-reaching topics. So I certainly think there's enough. We've certainly covered enough to stimulate people, and again, a lot of great intellectual information and conceptual ideas, and I think they're incredibly powerful. But at the end of the day, they really don't mean too much if we don't take what we've discussed, and allow that to influence how we move through grief, how we allow grief to move us very much on a physiological level. And then for me, from a TRE perspective, one of the beautiful things is being able to invoke this shaking and tremoring response, whether we're thinking about particular grief or whether we're just lying on the floor and letting the body move. The key thing is, summarizing all the discussion, is this is just a discussion, and I'm sure lots of us will have felt responses in the body, and it's about taking what we've discussed and talked about and open to, and then surrendering down into the physiology of our body to allow that to connect and express, and move through us and also move us.
Well said, well said. Thank you so much, Richmond. For our listeners, how would they find you or find some of the sources or resources that can help move them along?
So to find me, if you go to treaustralia.com, and there's lots of podcasts and free resources and talks more about TRE and stress release, trauma recovery, high performance, that sort of thing. If you'd like to learn the TRE technique, then if you go to, you can go through TRE Australia, or you can go straight to trecourse.com, and in there is a guided online course. It's got 3 sessions. It's got a screening tool at the beginning. So if you're someone who's got major history of major mental health difficulties or major medical concerns or major trauma, then you can do a screening tool and then link up to TRE providers around the world. And if you're looking for providers in Australia, treaustralia.com. But if you're in another country, then you can find TRE providers via the website traumaprevention.com. And we've got TRE providers in more than 80 countries around Australia. So if you're someone who likes online learning, there's a bit of theory, there's 3 guided sessions. So it's very much about giving you the basics and getting you started so you can use the tremoring technique on your own. I don't think there's anything particular in there. I mentioned using it for grief. So invoking the tremors, bringing certain things to mind. If that works well for you, then that can be really useful. But if you need further help, then you can find those TRE providers and work through things that way.
Thank you. Thank you so much for all the work that you've done in this area for the country. To all our listeners, I hope you take away at least 1 or 2 nuggets of wisdom. And if anyone needs to contact you, would you be contactable?
Yes, if people need to contact me, then through the TRE Australia website, you can contact me. If people want to do, like sessions or that sort of thing, then I can send a link to an online booking system. If people are looking to do guided sessions. But if you don't need to, if people feel the need to learn with a provider or with me, then I encourage you to follow that. But a lot of people will also go, gee, I feel like I could get online and work my way through the course and learn to get access to the tremors that way as well. So either way that works for people.
Yeah, that's such a cool resource. Thank you so much for developing that. I mean, you told me in a previous discussion that you did this over COVID, so salutations, man. That's a noble undertaking. So thank you for doing that.
Yeah.
And thank you for the conversation.
Yeah, likewise. You're very welcome. And it was part of doing the course, Amira, was that during COVID lockdowns in Melbourne, the world's most locked down city, I was very, very blessed to be receiving JobKeeper, which was government payments, which helped people who, I couldn't travel and do my normal workshops and training. So I was very lucky to be supported financially. And so as part of that time, I did want to, give something back in return for those sort of taxpayers' money. So that's how the online course came about. So it is a great resource. Please, check it out at trecourse.com and share it. Again, mainly through the lens of stress and tension and trauma, but hopefully through this discussion, you'll see the relevance of how that fits in with the area of grief. So thank you very much for having me. As I say, I think we've covered some pretty broad ranging and very meaningful topics and created, I think, a great pathway for people. So I'm very grateful for the opportunity and for you in creating this podcast.
Oh, thank you so much. I'm just humbled that you've taken so much time to share your expertise, and I hope everyone else enjoyed listening to this podcast. Thank you again, Richmond, and we'll catch up soon.
Good on you. Thanks, Amira.
All right. See you, everyone.